Hey, good day there. Ben here with Studio on the Lake. It's day after Thanksgiving, and it's that time again to start looking at Christmas stuff. So here's a pretty simple Santa done with power carving, and I went ahead and painted this character for you. So how do we get to this point? Well, first we start off with the wood, and this is a piece of cottonwood bark. It came from Canada, up there, Jordy Johnson over at Carving Fusion. You should check his stuff out if you haven't yet. Sent that to me, and you can see that I've played around with this on the bottom and various different things. So design process, nothing too creative here. I wanted to make a standard Santa with a hat, and I wanted to make him kind of a jolly, happy-looking character, and I wanted to make him squinting and well, like you would grin, your cheeks would come up and your eyes would be closed. And I'm just doing a rough layout here, really don't have a pattern for him. One thing I didn't want to happen is I didn't want this guy to be wood spirit looking, old man looking. So here's after I took it over to the bandsaw, as per my norm, don't copy what I'm doing here. I'm just cleaning up the back, taking some of the bark down, so I've got two things flat space there in the back, and taking some of that looser wood off there that will have a tendency to splinter off, as does with cottonwood bark. So the first thing to decide on this is where his hat comes in. He's going to have one of those caps that has the fur around it, a standard Santa with the big white rim on it, and it's going to go down into a pom-pom or a ball. And I picked this piece of wood particularly because it's a little bit wider. Once again, trying to get away from that thin look that comes in when you're doing a wood spirit, an old man wood spirit. Long and craggy face works well in that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the beard placement on this. This guy, I like the way he turned out. He is very straightforward and simple, but there's a bunch of carving tips in here for those of you that are beginning carvers, and maybe something in there for those of you that are a little bit more advanced. So I want to carve a little bit deeper in the face, and for beginner carvers, especially Calvin and Hobby, or Calvin over at Calvin Hobby, a guy that a young kid. I'm gonna address him a little bit in this. And Calvin, if you're watching this, take my advice or not. As if it works for you, use it. If it doesn't, let it go. So this is a cuts all tip or burr in here. It's an 1/8 inch sitting in there. That 1/8 inch will also work in all the Dremel sets, and then the other one was 3/32, which is a little smaller. This one got a little gummed up. I don't know why. I used it to carve a lot of stuff on there, and first thing I do is I take the torch, and some people will tell you don't do that, you'll take the temper out of it. Well, I got news for you. You got to get this thing pretty hot before the temper comes out of there. And as you can see, I'm just kind of char on the wood, and then I'm using a brass brush, and it cleans it up like brand new. And when this thing gets to the point where it doesn't cut much anymore, or cut as aggressively, then I'll replace it. But they tend to wear down, and that's kind of unique also, because instead of being a real aggressive cut at the initial part, the burr will mellow in like a fine wine, and the properties of the cut will change. It'll get smoother. So I get about a year probably worth of work out of these. Use them quite a bit. So you can see I'm kind of setting in the nose there. The first thing I wanted to do with this character was I wanted to have a big old bulbous nose. And as per my norm, I'm going to speed this up. This thing still is a little bit long. I am going to do the voiceover for the whole thing and talk about what I'm doing. So this is kind of a real tutorial. I'm trying not to take wood away. The highest point was going to be the end of his nose. As in most face carving, the nose is the most prominent feature in a lot of cases, and then followed by the cheeks, and then followed by the lips, and the eyes are set in there a little bit deeper. And beginner carvers and Calvin, hey, here's one thing I want you to note, that look how deep I'm carving with this thing. I'm cutting this in pretty big. I'm going to try to leave below his nose and his beard as the prominent part that sticks out to the front, so it would be angled back in, with the deepest point pretty much being the eyes in there. But one thing is, don't be afraid to carve too deep. So they're setting the eyebrows or the eyes to a lesser degree. And here's what I want you to see. Look how deep I carved that. Now, one thing I will say is don't use, or I wouldn't recommend you use Dremel carving bits. They're good for messing around with plastic, messing around with stuff, but they're not good for carving in wood. And particularly the harder the wood that you start getting into, the less that they'll carve you. They will work. You can spend a lot of time going over, but it's slow going. Get yourself a professional bit. This one's probably $15, and I'm guessing. And considering you'll pay what, $5 to $10 for a Dremel. Granted, they are available right off the shelf at any hardware store. A lot of times they're locked up in a cabinet. I guess they're small enough that they figure people will put them in their pocket. But you'll be so happy with a cut saw or a saber tooth burr. Either one of those, I use them both interchangeably. And it'll make a world of difference in the carving. It's also easier on the tools because the bit is cutting and it's not putting as much stress on the motor there. You'll see that I do the majority of this thing with 3 or 4 burrs, and I'll talk about them as I go down in there. So I'm really cutting this deep, and I'm trying to leave his face wider because he's going to have kind of a chubby face going on in there. It bugged me a little bit when I started playing around with this. I thought maybe I should have done him in basswood. But this cottonwood bark is so easy to carve, and I don't, when I do the cottonwood bark, I have a tendency to want to leave a lot of the natural shapes on there, and this one I'm not. I'm going to take a lot of stuff away. Now here's a note. I'm setting in the mustache. So if this was a wood spirit versus a Santa, that's the bottom of his mustache, and I want it to curl up. I want it to go left to right on his face as opposed to flowing down towards the bottom. And that's a really big difference versus a wood spirit face. So I've kind of got the lines of where I want that beard to go. And now I'm setting in the little depth part, which will be his mouth below it. I wanted to be able to see his lips in the whole thing. I'm not worrying about the hat necessarily right now. I'm just trying to get that face set in, because once I get the face set, relative depths and kind of positioning, then everything else tells me where it should go. One of the neat things about doing this carving, as I was doing it, I was noticing that I could have stopped pretty much at any point on this, and you would have an idea of what he was supposed to be, especially if we were to go ahead and paint him a red cap, white fringe around that, and then a pom-pom on there. You'd know that without a doubt that this is Santa, no matter what level I stopped. So now that's the fringe around the top of the cap there, and just setting that in. Those of you that are just starting carving, one thing you'll notice, and I'll point this out a couple times in the video, I don't spend a whole lot of time completely detailing out any particular portion of the carving. I'll work one section, and then I'll see something glaring in another section. I'm looking at the whole piece and slowly taking down different parts. Don't work one piece to death at the expense of playing around with the others, because you'll find out that you go overboard. If you do it in stages and complete and turn this thing and work on one section at a time very briefly, and then stop and work on another section, you'll see things that need corrected a lot better. Another technique for this is if you get into a bind, you're beginning carver, and you're not liking what you're seeing, stop. Don't continue on. Put that thing aside and work on another project for a little while, and then a couple days later or a week later, whatever your time frame is for carving, come back and take a look at it, and you'd be amazed at what a couple days will do. Sometimes I'll finish a carving up and really don't like it at all. It isn't working for me. I'll throw it off on the side, and sometimes as many as a couple of years later, I'll pull that carving out and like it again. I'll see something in it that I didn't see initially when I gave up on it. So don't throw your carvings away. By all means, don't throw them in the fire and get rid of them. That's just self-destructive. As far as people liking various different carvings, is something that I really particularly like. No one else likes. They don't see in it what I see in it, and that's the value of art, I guess. Short of all the experts down the road telling you what this thing's all about, they have no idea. They didn't carve it. They're just making shit up. So there you go. You can see how deep I set those initial lines, and these are all going to get smoothed out. I have no idea what's going to happen down at the bottom of this guy, because I didn't use a pattern on him. I'm just using this from what I think a Santa ought to look like in my brain, and I haven't changed the bit. This is not an extreme cuts all. This is some lesser grade, and I apologize. I got enough trash around the studio, so I throw those boxes away, and a lot of times I'm not 100% sure exactly which bit that I'm using. So now I'm working on the pom-pom, for lack of a better reference. It's the big white pom-pom that's going to sit on it. And I decided that I was far enough along that I could start setting his beard in. You'll notice on the side view there, the deepest part is his eyes, then his nose, and this whole thing is kind of levering back towards the top of his hat. So whitest at the bottom part of the beard. And this beard, again, is not going to flow downward, kind of like a spirit beard would, or like a lot of us tend to carve spirit beards. I'm just trying to keep the width in there, and I'm working with the flow. In this case, the flow is going to be kind of circular and chubby, for lack of better reference. Another thing I will mention, the studio is cold. Initially, you could see I do have a fire going out there, but I got started before the studio had warmed up. I run those two lenses if you watch how I operate, and you can see this one's starting to get kind of a grainy yellow, not clear to it. So I look up and I see that I kind of knew that this was going to happen. What happens is the inside of those lenses, not on the front of them, condenses with moisture, and it starts dimming the thing down. And at some point I find that I'm not getting a clear. I would prefer it to be clear all the time, of course, but I'll switch those lenses out. And I switched these lenses a couple times because each of them starts to fog over. There you go. See, that's the difference between a new lens and the lens that was in there. I mentioned earlier that you could stop it. I was noticing you could probably stop at any point in this character and tell what he was. So I did the rough carving with that cuts all bit. This is a ruby bit or a diamond bit. This one's actually ruby, and I'm treating it the same way. I'm going to torch a little bit of that stuff off there. I'm not staying on there long enough to pull the temper out, and then finish it off with a brass brush. There are people that'll tell you not to do this, but I don't think they know what they're talking about. Just like you may not think I know what I'm talking about. So, advice, as always, if it fits, if it works for you, use it. Give it a try. If it makes no sense to you and doesn't work, don't use it. There's nothing worse than an expert telling you exactly how things ought to be, because there's 100 different ways to do something. There's a lot of different ways to do this carving, and the best teacher is experience and time. So this ruby bit comes back in a little bit and does a finish group. You can do all of this with knives, a knife all by itself. You can do it with a chisel. Now, speaking of knives, Calvin, I'm going to go back to you. Lose the pocket knife. There's nothing more dangerous in the world than a pocket knife. A pocket knife will flip back on your fingers when you're carving, and you'll have a really nasty cut across the top of several fingers. I do notice in Calvin's case, he's using gloves. I've never got to the point of using gloves because I don't like the feel of them, and I really haven't cut myself carving in many years of carving, and a lot of that has to do with technique and thinking about what you're doing before you do it. But certainly, if you're a young carver or an old carver, or a lady picking up carving, it wouldn't hurt to have a safety glove in your hand. And then the other thing is, you'll see that I don't wear goggles or safety goggles, and I really should. But some of those bits can come apart. We're spinning these things at 30, 40,000. In Just Carve Rob over there, his air thing, heck, that goes into ludicrous range, 100,000 plus. Some of these bits weren't made to do that, and depending on what you're carving, they'll come unglued. So I'm redefining again. If you'll notice, I'm not working on any particular one portion of this. I didn't need to do an eyeball on this guy because I kind of wanted him to be squinting like you would if you had a big old grin on your face. And then I wanted to leave him with big old puffy cheeks in addition to his nose. And you can see I switched from the face over to try to work on the hair at the side. I haven't farted around with the beard necessarily yet. I haven't finished redefining the hat, and I'm working all over the piece and working him around. You'll see me do a pause there. I'll blow the sawdust off, and I'll pause and stare at it a little bit, and then go back to another piece. I think a lot of this was done in either 2 or 3 times the speed. So when I do slow down, you'll notice that there are pauses in there, and that's where I'm gawking at this guy and trying to decide if what I'm doing is copying or recreating what I see in the picture in my mind of how this guy goes. These ruby bits will give you a really fine sanding finish. This one happens to be a taper, which I like. I run these things in a ball also or a spear, and that leaves a unique shape on there. I'm not, you see me skipping around with it. I want to leave a lot of the texture in there. I don't want this to be smooth, otherwise I'd take a piece of sandpaper and sand it down. So sitting there, you can see that this character, I could probably stop right in here, and you would have an eye. You would know what he was. So a lot of carving is representative. I've said it 100 times before. Carving is working with planes and shadows. I'm carving it a little bit deeper under that beard there. That's creating a shadow. It's also creating a plane. One of the unique things about hand tools and that sort of stuff is it leaves really nice facets or faucets, levels and whatnot from the knife cuts, and that's a unique thing in and of itself. A chisel, of course, will leave a little bit of a U shape, and as you layer those over each other, that's an effect that works really well in carving also. So it doesn't have to be smooth like sculpture. If you look at a lot of the old Greek statues that were made with marble, they didn't actually carve a pupil in there. They just carved a big old hole right in the middle of the eye, representative of the pupil, and then you back off 4 or 5 feet, and you'll see that hole creates a shadow, and in your brain that says pupil. And then you get up close and you think, well, that's kind of weird. You just got a big old hole drilled right in the middle of the eyeball. So I've switched to a smaller taper ruby bit, and then here again I'm switching again, and this is that one was a spear. This one's actually a taper, and I'm trying to cut a line down where his eyelid or eyeball would be in the center there. Again, he's squinting with his cheeks and everything smiling up towards the top. And I will cut kind of an eyelid under there once I get that where it's going. Now that I've taken all the bark off this thing, it kind of looks a lot like basswood. Okay, speaking of wood, I want to come back to Calvin here. You can see I'm cutting that eyeball under there. Hey, yeah, obviously, beginner carvers, you carve anything you can get your hands on. I've carved some decoys out of the strangest wood, and it just happened to be what I could get a hold of. A lot of times it's firewood or a chunk of wood that's laying out somewhere. By all means, grab those. Try to carve them, whether you're a power carver or a hand carver. But when it comes right down to it, there's 2 or 3 woods that really represent themselves to carving. One is basswood, and I think that's the number one across the board. If you're a professional bird carver, Tupelo doesn't fuzz as much with the power carvings and takes finer feather details. Tupelo is hard to come by unless you live in the south by the swamp. And then the third, so the best wood obviously is basswood in my opinion for carving, depending on what you're doing. Secondary to that is sugar pine, which you can get out on the east coast of the U.S. I don't know about up in Canada. The third would be cedar. Cedar is a softer wood and lends itself readily to carving. A lot of fish decoy folks or fishing lure people use cedar, and it has to do with its property of not rotting away. And then last but not least, we've got something that's relatively new to me, is this cottonwood bark, and Jordy sent me the cottonwood bark. So Calvin, if you're up to it, one of these days I might send you some basswood if you're interested. I sent some to Just Carve Rob. I sent some to Jordy, and you'll love how that stuff carves. So if you're interested, let me know, and I'll get a box off in the mail to you of some basswood. Make Jordy go out to his stash and send you some cottonwood bark. You'll really dig the way this stuff carves. But you got to change your bits, man. You got to get a Cutzall or a Saber bit and get rid of those Dremel bits. And in that, pick up a ruby bit when you're looking, or a diamond. The cheap diamond bits don't work. They tend to burn, and they are exactly what you think they were. They're cheap. But most of these bits are $10-15 a piece, and if you're a kid like Calvin is, go ahead and save your lunch money or whatever. Of course, he's got a shop. Go check his stuff out. It's Calvin and Hobbies, and it's pretty cool. Gene Messer, if you're watching this, Calvin, you should go over and check out Gene Messer. Gene's been carving for many years. He uses carving knives, bench knives. I was going to tell you to get rid of that pocket knife and get a bench knife, but looks like you already did that in one of the last videos. So here's enough about me. Well, that's enough advice. I had to resist the temptation to really get in the nitty-gritty and put all the hairs in this beard and this guy. Each step of the way here, he has looked quite a bit like I could stop. I did do him with the intention of painting him, not necessarily staining him, and I like how the paint came out. There's only a few colors. Okay, so I switched to a ball. Anytime you see me with that black handpiece, it has a 3/32 collet in it, and those are the bits. Anytime you see the blue handpiece, I run an 1/8" collet in that. If you only have one, run an 1/8" collet and buy a sleeve that sits inside of that collet. So when you put the 3/32 bit in there, slide the sleeve over it, stick it in there, and you really don't have to mess around with changing collets on that. But if like in my case, I have the two, the older version and the newer one, and they sit beside my chair. If you go back and look at my studio setup, you'll see that, and I can just switch hand pieces at random and don't have to mess around with the collet. So if you got $400 or $500, buy a second carver, and so you don't have to mess around with changing bits. This ball, I'm kind of putting little divots and whatnot on his white fuzzy, whatever the heck it is, around that knit cap. I'm using it to smooth over and get a good flow down into that big old bulbous nose. And once again, you see that I am switching all over the place. I'll see an area that looks like it needs some attention, and then I'll work on that for a little bit, and then I'll give up and go somewhere else. And that gives you an overall round carving and a complete carving, rather than finishing one complete piece. There was a nice pause in there while I stare at it and see if it's doing what I see in my brain. When I'm filming, I've got two photography lights, and one's over my right shoulder, one's over my left shoulder, in addition to the shop lighting. I picked up the burning pin just to delineate a couple of lines in here. Rob over at Just Carve Rob says he uses them because the paint likes to stop at that line. It creates kind of a stop cut where the paint doesn't want to run down into the next section. I think that's probably a true statement. I've never thought of that before. In the times that I've done that and been burning for years. For the equipment, you need to go back and take a look at some of the other videos. There's a bunch of them on there, and I'll probably do some more. I'm not burning a whole lot here. I'm just trying to get a couple of lines to stand out, and you can get a nice effect with the burner and leave it all by itself. In this case, it looks like I'm ruining this guy because these things are getting highlighted, but I had every intention of painting and this stuff is all going to disappear in the painting. Speaking of painting, there's a if you really want it to the paint to set in and do different layers, you'll need to seal it with a sealer, and a good sealer for these is gesso, as most painters know. You can put a couple coats of gesso on this and steel wool or sand them. I like to use triple-aught steel wool in a lot of cases as the final sanding, and then you can paint over that. Lately, I haven't been doing any competition pieces or really fine detail pieces, and I forego the step of sealing at the expense a lot of times of having to put on 2 or 3 coats of paint as it sinks into the wood, depending on what kind of wood it is. So this guy's getting down there towards the end, and as always, sign your pieces. You don't want to cheat a relative in the future out of someone finding your wonderful piece of folk art or artwork, which is worth absolutely nothing when you're alive. You can't sell it, and then some art collector or whatever starts to like what you did long after you're dead. It seems only fair that you should sign it so they know for sure that it's one of your pieces, and your relative can take a picture of it, save the picture, and then sell the actual carving and pay all their bills. I sign typically BAM, BAM, my initials, and then I'll put the year in there. There was a time when I was doing a lot of carving where I'd actually put the month in there. The drawback to this, of course, is if you decide to pull something out 15 years later and sell it, someone's like, oh, that's not one of their new carvings. Of course, the inverse of that is if you get ridiculously famous, and as Jordy would say, people start sending $1 gazillion for your carvings, you can whip out some of those old carvings that didn't look so nice and get your $1 gazillion. People can call that your whatever period. In painting they say it's a blue period or a yellow period or whatever. So I'll burn typically into the piece, and then I will sign it. In this case, I just signed it with a pencil. So that's the character. It's pretty straightforward. You could have stopped at any point along there and known what that guy was. And once he's all painted like that, you got yourself a Santa Claus. I haven't decided whether I'm going to make this guy hang on the wall. You kind of saw the size of him. I don't know, heck, he's 3-4 inches tall and whatnot. And you could hang him from the tree if you stuck something in the top of his head there, or whatever, and you can hang him on the wall. So there you go, Santa Claus. It's that time of year. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Check out some of these other folks. I will put this guy in the Etsy shop. Thanks a lot. This has been Ben with Studio on the Lake.